what is veneration? This is a critical question if you're going to be talking about things like icon veneration or relic veneration or the veneration of saints. If you don't know what veneration is, you're not going to get those subjects as well. This is also critical for people who practice veneration to ensure that they're practicing the veneration of saints in a way that's consistent with church teachings and the scriptures. There's a lot of false information out there or just misinformation, even in Orthodox circles and Catholic circles, and even in Orthodox and Catholic literature and catechetical material. So today we're going to go deep into this question and really get to the nitty-gritty details of what veneration is. If you haven't already, please subscribe. You're going to find information here in this channel that you won't find anywhere else, I promise you. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So the English words for worship and venerate have no equivalents in biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek. Okay, so the Little Oxford Dictionary defines worship as the practice of praising and praying to a god or goddess. Now, this definition doesn't correspond to any Greek or Hebrew word in the Bible. This is a huge deal. That when I understood this and this clicked in my brain, it absolutely blew my mind, because it means that the language that we are using to talk about veneration and worship aren't even the same words with the same meanings that the Bible is using and church tradition are using when they talk about these things, okay? And the way we define venerate, okay, doesn't even have the same meaning as the original Greek word that it's supposed to be a translation of. So Koine Greek is the language of the Bible, the New Testament, and the Septuagint. It's the language of the early church fathers, the Greek fathers, the fathers of icons, the Council of Nicaea too. They're all using the same language and the same linguistic framework. And English doesn't even correspond to that, okay? So we have a problem when you're talking about these topics like saint veneration, veneration of icons, veneration of relics, and these things. We're not even using the same words with the same meanings that the council used to authoritatively define these practices for the church. And that was using the same language as the scriptures. So the only way we can really talk accurately about the topic of veneration and worship is to bypass English altogether and go directly into those Greek words and Hebrew words and really understand their meanings in their original languages. That will help us to understand the meaning of veneration and just bypass the word altogether in English, because it's not a very good translation of the Greek word it was meant to represent. So the original Greek word behind the word venerate in most translations is Prokyneo. Okay, you might be familiar with this Greek word. It's the original word used by the Seventh Ecumenical Council when talking about the veneration of saints. It's also in the Greek Fathers. So you have in the definition of the Second Council of Nicaea, it says, holy images are to be accorded greeting and the veneration of honor. It uses the phrase timitikin proskinisin. Okay, so proskinisin, proskineo. Not indeed the true worship, Latreia, corresponding to our faith, which pertains to the divine nature alone. So this statement was originally spoken and written down in Greek, and it used the word proskyneo for the veneration of saints. And in the Old Testament, the Hebrew equivalent to the Greek word proskyneo is Shacah, which has the exact same meaning as demonstrated in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew, and whenever the word Shacah is used in Hebrew, the word proskyneo is used in the Septuagint, okay? So these two words have a correspondence. And in Aramaic, the word segid or sagad have the same meaning as Shacah and proskyneo. Now, this segid, sagad, and Shacah in the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament correspond to proskyneo in the Septuagint in 96% of instances. Okay, so 96% is a really high percentage of correspondence between these two words. So we know when we're reading in the Old Testament and the word Shacah is there, it has a 96% correspondence to proskyneo, which that the Seventh Ecumenical Council used to describe what we do when we're venerating the saints. So the Old Testament now comes into play and is relevant for this discussion. Now, proskyneo or Shacah in the Bible is a physical act with the body. This is important because a lot of people talk about veneration as a kind of sentiment or feeling, something like this, but it's actually a physical act. It's a gesture that you do with your body. And it simply means bowing or prostrating. Okay, so the body goes down. Sometimes it's translated as kneeling. So Shacah in Old Testament Hebrew, and this is from Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, it means to bow down, to prostrate oneself. Sagid or sagad in Aramaic means to do homage by prostration. Prokyneo in Septuagint Greek is to fall down in worship, to do reverence to do obeisance to prostrate oneself before, okay? And this is Lust, Einikel, and Hauspie's lexicon for the Greek of the Septuagint. Prokyneo in New Testament Greek, same meaning, fall down and worship, to do obeisance to prostrate oneself before. Okay, that's from BDAG. So you see, it doesn't matter if it's biblical Hebrew, biblical Aramaic, biblical Greek, Septuagint, New Testament, it all means the same thing in those original languages of bowing down or prostrating oneself. Now, unlike the English translations of Prokyneo, like venerate, Prokyneo has a wide range of applications. In other words, there's not one intention when somebody does Prokyneo. The intention is really depending on the context of the situation. So sometimes Prokyneo is done honoring a person. Sometimes it's done begging for help from a person. Sometimes it's done asking a favor from a person. Sometimes it's worshiping a god. It could be any one of these depending on the context and the intention of the person doing the Prokyneo, or the Shacah if it's in the Hebrew Old Testament. In other words, it's a flexible word, and its meaning depends a lot on the context and the intention of the person doing it. This is very different than the word worship and the word venerate in English, both of which are translations of Prokyneo. Worship is very specific to a god or to a goddess. Veneration is very specific. It's not worship, it's giving honor to a saint. But Prokyneo could be either one of these depending on the intention of the person doing it. So just recognizing that in the original languages, when they're saying that we give Prokyneo to saints, that Prokyneo has a flexible range of meanings, including honoring or asking for help. And that's very important. It's a very important nuance to understand in the original languages. Now, in the Bible itself, we see a full range of meanings for Prokyneo or Shacah. So, for example, in Genesis 42:6, Joseph's brothers prostrate themselves before Joseph in his honor, using that Hebrew word Shacah in the Septuagint, it's Prokyneo. Exodus 18:7, Moses prostrates before Jethro, greeting him. So now it's a gesture of greeting when he sees his father-in-law Jethro. Prokyneo is sometimes pleading or beseeching, like in Matthew 18:26, the servant prostrates before his master, beseeching him. In Matthew 20:20, James and John's mother prostrates to Jesus, beseeching him to make her son sit at his right and left sides. In Matthew 8:2, the leper prostrates to Jesus, beseeching him for help. So you see right in the scripture that sometimes if you're asking for a favor from somebody, you do a prostration before them. Those are biblical examples of Prokyneo, of pleading or beseeching. And of course, Prokyneo can also be worship, like in Hebrews 1:6, the angels are worshiping Jesus, and it uses the word Prokyneo there. Now, because Prokyneo can either be towards a human or a god, it's also the Greek word most often behind the English word worship. Okay, so in the King James Version, Prokyneo is the Greek word behind worship 76% of the time. And in the NIV, it's 69% of the time. So if you're looking for the Greek word for worship, it's also Prokyneo. So it opens up some confusion here, because we hear often the phrase, we don't worship icons, we venerate them, or we don't worship saints, we venerate them, something like this. But in Greek, the original language of the Greek fathers in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, this sentence would be very meaningless and contradictory, because it would sound like we don't give Prokyneo to icons, we give Prokyneo to them, okay, which is quite confusing and contradictory. So just understanding, again, bypassing that English language of worship and venerate and going to the original languages, the intention of Prokyneo determines whether or not it's worshipful or honorific. So it'd be more accurate to say something like we honor saints with a bow of honor, and we worship God with a bow of worship. Okay, so the gesture might be similar to what we're doing towards a saint, what we're doing towards God, but the intention is very different because of what we believe about who the saint is versus who we believe God is. Very different intentions there. So to distinguish Prokyneo intended to people versus Prokyneo intended to God alone, the Greek fathers defined not two words like worship and venerate or adoration and veneration, but two kinds of the same word, Prokyneo, which are distinguished by the intention of the person doing it. So those two kinds are called Latreias proskinesis, which is a Prokyneo of divine service. Okay, it's like a divine religious duty to a god. Or timitiki proskinesis, the other kind, which is just a Prokyneo of honor from that Greek word timi, which means honor. So you can see these two intentions for proskinesis or proskyneo in the Bible itself. For example, in Hebrews 1:6, it says, "Let all the angels of God worship him." So obviously the angels are worshiping Jesus. It's using that word, the root word proskyneo, to worship Jesus. But we see the exact same word used in the Septuagint, again, backed by Shacah in Hebrew with the same meaning, 96 correspondence rate. It says, "The brothers of Joseph coming bowed to him with their face on the earth." It uses that same word, proskyneo or Shacah, the same word used for worship in Hebrews. So obviously, there's a difference in the intention between the angels who are worshiping Jesus as God and Joseph's brothers who are bowing down before him in honor, even though the same word is being used in the Bible. So this Bible-based distinction, again, it's unavoidable from the scriptures, it relieves Orthodox and Catholics of the charge of idolatry. So you can't say that every time a Catholic or Orthodox person does a bow or a prostration before a saint that they're worshiping that saint. Because the original word, even in the Bible, can have a range of meanings depending on the intention. So whether or not an Orthodox or Catholic is worshiping a saint or honoring them by bowing is determined by the intention of that person doing it. So you can't say that every time they bow or they venerate an icon or a saint, they're worshiping it, okay, as a god. So if bowing in veneration to a saint is worshiping him, then Joseph's brothers are idolaters. And Joseph believed himself to be a god. Okay, so it's using that word for worship, the Hebrew word for worship. It means that all of Joseph's brothers are idol worshippers and bowing down and worshiping to Joseph, and he's just sulking it in, thinking himself to be a god. Now, this is, of course, absurd. Nobody would say that Joseph thinks he's a god and Joseph's brothers think he's a god. They would recognize that timitiki proskinesis, that bowing, prostrating of honor that they're giving to their brother Joseph. Therefore, to recognize that Joseph's brothers intended honor towards Joseph, not worship, necessarily acknowledges the existence of timitiki proskinesis. So this is not something that the Seventh Ecumenical Council invented. This is not something the Greek fathers made up, just invented one day. This is something right in the Bible, and they're just giving it a label. They're saying, hey, proskinesis in this situation is a worshipful kind. Proskinesis in this situation is an honorific kind. They're just calling out the obvious. So when Christians bow down, do proskyneo in prayers to saints or before icons or relics, that doesn't mean that they're worshiping them. Rather, they intend the biblical timitiki proskinesis, which we see in the Bible again and again and again. And the intentions that they have are not worship. It's beseeching the saints to pray for us, like how Abigail beseeched David for a favor. So you see this intention of beseeching that's connected to proskyneo. When Orthodox and Catholics do veneration, bowing, prostrating towards a saint, they're asking for that saint's prayers with a bodily invocation. Just like you see in the Bible how Abigail beseeched David for a favor. It says, "Now when Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey, fell on her face before David, and bowed down to the ground," using that word Shacah. "So she fell at his feet and said, 'On me, my Lord, on me let this iniquity be.'" That's from 1 Samuel 25:23. So she's doing that Shacah, that proskyneo in the Septuagint, before David, asking him for this favor. The second meaning that proskyneo has that Christians apply to the saints is honoring the saints. Just like how Ruth honored Boaz. In Ruth 2:10, it says, "So she," that's Ruth, "fell on her face, bowed down to the ground," again using that Hebrew word shakah, "and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me since I am a foreigner?'" Okay, so she thinks so highly of him that she's falling down on her face and doing this proskineo, this shakah, or prostration before Boaz. And with that same intention, Orthodox Christians can do a bow or prostration towards a saint in honor of that saint. So we can see these intentions in the fathers and in the life of the historic church. So if you read church history or you read ancient Christian writings, you begin to see some of these in practice, especially on saints' feast days when Christians would visit saints' tombs and shrines to honor the saint. Okay, so in church history, one of the common church practices was on certain days of the year, Christians would commemorate martyrs or other saints by going to their burial place, and they would honor that saint and they would ask for that saint's prayers. Okay, so they would do things like prostrations, bowing, kissing, lighting lamps, lighting candles, and asking for that saint's prayers. So one example is in the writings of St. John Chrysostom. This is from the 4th century. He was preaching to the church in Constantinople, and he says, "On there, that is the martyrs' day, an entire city and so great a body of those in office, emperor and consuls and military commanders and everyone, assemble in the martyr's tomb and cast off the signs of inequality associated with this present life. For neither the rich person, nor the poor person, nor the governor, nor his subject is seen here. Instead, everyone has put aside this differentiation. They enjoy homogeneity because of the esteem and honor directed towards the martyr. Even the emperor takes off his diadem, and his bodyguards and shield bearers throw their lances and spears and shields outside, and thus approach the martyr's shrine, and every dissimilarity weakens and gives way through awe of these saints. And he who wears the purple and sets everything shaking at his nod, often throws himself face down upon the martyr's tomb and calls for that saint's prayers. And if he goes off to battle, he goes away taking him," that is the martyr, "as his ally." So we have all of these elements here in this description by St. John Chrysostom of the scene of venerating a martyr on that saint's feast day. And this is in the 4th century, okay? This is very early. This is the early church. And you can see how important venerating the saint is and what that means within the early church. It means honoring and asking for that saint's prayers, and it includes falling down, face down in that martyr's tomb before that saint's relics and icon. Okay, so there's a purpose, it's a purposeful prostration for getting prayers from that saint so that they can receive the grace of God and honor God by honoring that saint. So the Council of Nicaea defined the proskineo to God alone as latrias proskinisis. But where does the word latrias come from? So I think it's important to take a moment to kind of explain why they chose specifically the word latrias to define that kind of proskineo that's directed to God alone, because I think it's very important. It takes advantage of Greek's unique word latreia. Okay, you may have heard it as latreia, right? And it means in Greek simply to serve, just means serve. But it also includes a linguistic nuance that it is service to God alone. Okay, so it's a divine service. Okay, BDAG describes it as service or worship of God. That latria is to God alone is a unique feature of the Greek language. Hebrew does not have this. Latin does not have this. English does not have this. So the fact that Greek has a special word, latria, which is to God alone, makes it a convenient way to explain and describe the kind of proskineo that is to God alone. Okay, so we have the proskineo that's that timitiki kind, the honorific bowing, but there's that special latrias proskinisis, which is the bowing of that divine service, which is due to God alone. And this is acknowledged by Jesus himself in Matthew 4:10. It says, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." And it uses the word mono, only, with the word serve, which is laterevsis. Okay, so in this passage, Jesus is saying you shall worship, okay, you should bow down or prostrate to the Lord your God. Okay, you should do that. But only God can get latreivsis, which is latreia. So the word is only attached to latreivsis. So it's something exclusive to God alone, and Jesus is acknowledging that in this command. Latreia distinguishes itself from the other Greek word called doulia, which just means service in a general sense. So it also means service. So both latreia and doulia mean serve or service. And the difference is latreia is to God alone, where doulia can be to God or it can be to a person without being idolatrous. So St. John of Damascus writes, the veneration of worship, he uses the phrase latreias proskinisis, is one thing. Veneration offered in honor to those who excel on account of something worthy is another, okay? So there's that proskinisis, that's the latreias kind, and then there's the proskinisis, the honorific kind, that timitiki proskinisis. So St. John of Damascus here is relying on this word latreias to specify that kind of bowing of honor that's to God alone. Now, is this splitting hairs to justify a development, or is this lawyering or technical patristic innovations or something like this? And the answer is no, it's not. This goes way back, all the way to the 3rd century BC with the Jewish translators of the Septuagint. So in the Septuagint, both latreia and doulia are translations of the same Hebrew word avad, which means service. So in Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament, there's a word for service called avad. And sometimes that avad is to God, and sometimes that avad is to people. And the Septuagint translators are looking at that, looking at the context and the intention of the person doing the avad. And if it's towards God, they translate it as latreia. And if it's towards humans, they translate it as doulia. Okay, so they made that distinction all the way back then. This is the 3rd century BC, before Christ. So depending on the intention of the servant, the one doing the service, the Septuagint translators chose latreia or doulia. So an example of this is Deuteronomy 6:13, compared with Genesis 29:18. In the Masoretic text, both of these passages use the Hebrew word avad, but in the Septuagint, there are 2 different words used, latreivsis and doulevso, okay? So here's what that looks like. Deuteronomy 6:13, you shall fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hebrew uses that word avad. Well, Genesis 29 says, it's talking about Jacob serving Laban. It says, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And that Hebrew is using the exact same word avad. Okay, so what is it? Are we to serve God, or are we to serve people? Because it's the same Hebrew word. Well, the Septuagint translators are saying, well, there's a different kind of service to God from the service that you give to man. And they translate the Deuteronomy 6:13 instance of avad as latreia, and they translate the Genesis 29:18 instance of avad as doulia. So you can see that distinction goes way back before the time of Christ. This has been a part of Jewish tradition since the time of the Septuagint translators. And so that's the word that the Seventh Ecumenical Council is using to specify that kind of divine worshipful honor through Prokyneo, defining it as latreias proskinisis, to God alone. And this distinction is also recognized in the New Testament as well, by the way. Romans 1:25 says they exchanged the truth of God for the lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator, who is blessed forever. And that word served is using the base word latreia. But in 1 Corinthians 9:19, Paul says, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win the more. And he uses that word doulia as its root. Now, what happened? Did Paul become an idolater and start serving everyone as gods? No, of course not. So he's making the distinction between the people who gave latreia to the creature were idolaters, but I'm going to give doulia to everyone to serve them. And that's okay because it's doulia, it's not latreia. So he's also making this distinction in the New Testament. So when the Greek fathers used the phrase latreias proskinisis, they specified that when they bow to saints, relics, or icons, they are not giving to men or objects a divine honor which belongs to God alone. That's categorized under latreias proskinisis and is set apart within the linguistic framework that was established all the way back at the time of the Septuagint translation. So what about kissing? A lot of people think, okay, I'm going to venerate an icon, so I'll kiss it. That's venerating the icon. Well, in patristic terms, the act of kissing an icon or relic is technically not Prokyneo. It's technically not veneration if you kiss an icon, but it's something different called spazome, which is greeting or saluting the icon or the saint. And confusingly, Prokyneo can be a gesture of greeting, for example, in Genesis 33:3, and possibly the word is derived from an ancient Bronze Age Greek word for kiss, kineo. However, in Koine Greek, which is that Greek of the Septuagint, the New Testament, the Greek Fathers, Council of Nicaea II, Prokyneo generally just refers to bowing or prostrating, okay? So in biblical and patristic times, greeting was done via kissing and is instructed in the Bible. So there's a biblical basis for the practice of kissing an icon that is distinct from Prokyneo, which is bowing before a saint. Okay, so it's a slightly different practice with a different Greek word in the original language. Some cultures still greet with kisses, by the way, which I think you're probably familiar with. And in the Orthodox practice, the liturgical practices, there is something called the kiss of peace that happens between clergy and is a continuation of an ancient practice of Christians greeting each other with kisses. And according to BDAG, a spazome means welcome or greet someone, and specifies that among friends, the greeting is accompanied by a kiss. So we have veneration or Prokyneo, which is a prostration or bowing, but there's something else which is distinct from that called a spazome, which is greeting with a kiss, okay? And there are biblical examples and precedents for this practice. Luke 1:39 through 40 says, "Now Mary arose in those days and went into the hill country with haste to a city of Judea and entered the house of Zacharias and greeted Elizabeth," using the word based on spazome. In Philippians 4:21, Paul says, "Greet every saint in Christ Jesus," using that word spazome. In Romans 16:16, he says, "Greet one another with a holy kiss." Again, a spazome. So there's a biblical precedence for this practice towards saints as well. And it's the exact same word and sense that's used at the Council of Nicaea II when it says to greet the saints by kissing icons. It says holy images are to be accorded greeting using the Greek word spazome, the same one that Paul used. And the veneration of honor, not indeed the true worship corresponding to our faith, which pertains to the divine nature alone. Now, the Seventh Ecumenical Council requires both Prokyneo and a spazome to be given to saints, and they follow with they're following examples directly from the Bible. And it's important to note here that it's not a wild free-for-all. You're not instructed and allowed to do whatever you want to honor a saint. The church has traditional ways of expressing honor through Prokyneo and a spazome, right? Bowing and prostrating before a saint, or kissing a relic or an icon of that saint to give that spazome. It's just not a complete wild free-for-all. These are the ways that the church has always practiced honor, and it goes way back to the time of the Bible. These are examples in the Bible that we have to show us how to give these kinds of honors to saints. So the Council of Nicaea says holy images are to be accorded greeting, that's a spazome, and the veneration, that's the Prokyneo of honor. So both of these things are two distinct ways to give honor. And while these two practices physically are different, one is bowing, one is kissing, they're based in two different Greek words, the intention is still the same, to give love and to give honor towards the saints. But unfortunately, a spazome is pretty much forgotten in a lot of modern catechetical resources and is usually compounded with the word venerate. But these really should be distinguished as two distinct ways to give honor to saints. So even though you might say we venerate the icons, it might be more accurate to say we venerate and we greet icons, right? Because we venerate and greet the saints, just like we saw Paul doing, and just like we saw the saints in the Old Testament doing prostrations as a form of honor and invocation. So Christians in the Christian tradition have integrated these practices into liturgical life. So if you just follow the liturgical practices of the church, it'll actually guide you into the proper way to show honor through doing these two gestures. So for example, in the Orthodox Church, there's the tradition of when you enter or exit the church, you kiss and do a bow before an icon. So you have both the aspazome and the Prokyneo. It's both. It's not one or the other. It's both of them that Orthodox Christians do. And if you ever visit an Orthodox church, you'll see people come in, they make the sign of the cross, they kiss an icon, they bow, and then they go in the church. And this is following to the letter the definition of the Council of Nicaea II, which is applying both of these biblical practices to the saints to give them honor. Catholics have similar practices. One example is on Good Friday, they do kneeling and they kiss before a cross of Christ. So again, that Prokyneo, that spasome in practice in the liturgical traditions of the Catholic Church. So putting all of these words together, the original language vocabulary of veneration and worship, we have Hebrew, Koine Greek, and English words on a table here. I would memorize this, okay? I highly suggest memorizing this or taking a screenshot or something, because this is showing the relationship between these words, and it's very important to just bypass that English and remember these original words, because these are the vocabulary that the church fathers and the scriptures are using to talk about worship and veneration. So we have in Hebrew Shacah, which means Prokyneo, and there are two types of Prokyneo, the Latreia kind and the Timitiki kind. And the Latreia kind in English pretty much means worship, but it kind of means the older meaning of worship of bowing. It doesn't mean that newer version, which is like singing and praising. Like that's not really worship in the biblical sense. It means bowing or prostrating in the biblical meaning. And then that Timitiki proskinesis is that veneration or that reverence that through bowing or prostrating. The Hebrew word avad means service, and in English there's just one word for service, but in Greek there are two words for this, latreia and doulia, and again this helps to distinguish the kind of bowing that's to God or to people. And then ospazome, that greeting or saluting, which is traditionally done by kissing, and timi, honor, which helps to specify that kind of proskyneo of honor. Now, regardless of which of these you do, whether it's Prokyneo or a spasome or other things like lighting a lamp or lighting a candle or censing with incense, if it's directed towards a saint, the intention is the same, to honor, to show love to that saint, which we believe ultimately is an honor and love to God, because these are God's friends and God's sons, and we're asking for that saint's prayers. So these are actually bodily prayers and worshiping God by honoring his saints, right? And then asking for that saint's prayers. And if it's to God that we're doing the Prokyneo and the aspazome, then it is a kind of worship, because it's directed towards a God. It's intended towards God. And it's an invocation for his grace and mercy. So very important to understand that when you kiss an icon, there's a purpose for it. There's an intention of honoring God and receiving the prayers of that saint. So you can see all of these practices in the Orthodox Church, which are distinct and based in distinct Greek words. The Prokyneo, that's the veneration, which is a physical bowing or prostrating. There's censing, where they swing a censer towards an icon or a relic, or even towards a person, which is a gesture of honor. There's lighting a lamp or lighting a candle, which again is another way to express honor and ask for that saint's prayers. And then there's a spasome, which is kissing it, greeting that saint either in the icon or in the relic. So all of these are distinct, but the intention is ultimately the same, to give honor to that saint and to honor God and to ask for that saint's prayers. So in conclusion, veneration is one of the gestures that the Seventh Ecumenical Council prescribes for expressing honor to a saint. Other ways of giving honor are greeting with a kiss, called aspazome, lighting a candle or a lamp, and censing. Veneration is a physical bow or prostration called Prokyneo. It's a physical act of the body with the intention of honoring a saint and asking for that saint's prayers. This is distinguished from a bow of divine service, or Latreias proskinesis, which is intended to God alone by that doulia Latreia distinction that Greek has. And this can look scary, right? Like the bowing down before things can look like worship to eyes which are not familiar with these practices. But we should remember that the Bible itself shows that bowing is not necessarily worship. Again, think Joseph's brothers. Were they worshiping Joseph? Because it used the Greek word Prokyneo in the Septuagint, and it used the Hebrew word Shacah, which is typically translated as worship. But of course not, right? So the Bible is showing that bowing is not always worship. It can have other intentions, which are those intentions that Christians have towards saints. So the basis for this practice is in the Bible and church tradition, like St. John Chrysostom described that the people would fall down before the relics of the saints, asking for their prayers and going there to honor that saint. That's a part of church tradition. That's 4th century. It's very, very ancient, and it's been around since the very beginning of the church, this honor towards the martyrs of Christ. And there are many cases of prostrations of honoring people, greeting them, and asking for their help throughout church history and in the Bible. So thank you for watching. I hope that clarified some things. Hopefully it's not more confusing. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. I love hearing from you. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.
If